Imagine walking into a grocery store and seeing the price of everyday items, spices, electronics, clothing, suddenly jump by half. That's the kind of shock a 50% tariff on imports from India could create for Americans. Today, I'll walk you through what such a tariff would mean for U.S. consumers, businesses, the economy, and geopolitics, and why the effects would be more complicated than they might first appear. Quick roadmap. Here's how we'll proceed. First, a plain language explanation of what a 50% tariff actually is. Then, the immediate and short-term impacts. Next, the longer-term structural effects on supply chains, inflation, and jobs. A look at sector winners and losers, possible retaliation and geopolitical fallout, and finally, policy alternatives and a brief conclusion. What is a 50% tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports. A 50% tariff on goods from India means that for every $100 worth of eligible imports, U.S. importers would have to pay an additional $50 to the U.S. government on top of the base price. That extra cost can be absorbed by importers, passed on to consumers, or squeezed out of suppliers, and the distribution of that burden determines who really pays. Immediate impacts: prices and consumers. The most obvious and fastest effect would be higher prices for American consumers. Items heavily sourced from India, think textiles and apparel, some pharmaceuticals active ingredients, spices, certain consumer electronics components, and IT services packaged as goods, would become more expensive. Retailers would face choice, accept lower margins or pass costs to shoppers. In practice, many retailers would raise prices, especially where alternatives are limited, which would push up consumer inflation, already a key concern for policymakers. Short-term impacts: businesses and supply chains. U.S. companies that rely on Indian inputs would see costs spike. Manufacturers using Indian-made parts would face narrower profit margins or higher prices for finished goods. Smaller firms with less pricing power would be most vulnerable. Supply chains are sticky. Pivoting to other suppliers takes time and often costs more. So many firms would struggle in the short run, potentially delaying projects, cutting hiring, or passing costs to customers. Macroeconomic effects: inflation, growth, and monetary policy. A broad 50% tariff would add upward pressure on inflation. Central banks respond to inflation, and higher prices could force tighter monetary policy, higher interest rates, which cools investment and growth. So the tariff could create a trade-off, protect some domestic producers, but slow the broader economy. The net effect on GDP depends on how large the trade volume with India is in the affected categories, but even moderate inflationary upticks matter to households and markets. Labor market and jobs. Who wins, who loses political arguments for tariffs often emphasize protecting domestic jobs. Some U.S. manufacturing or textile firms that directly compete with Indian imports could benefit, at least temporarily, and may expand hiring. But many American businesses that use Indian imports as inputs, technology firms, pharmaceutical companies, retailers, would face higher costs and could shed jobs. Economists generally find that tariffs protect a narrow set of jobs while imposing costs across many sectors and consumers. The net employment effect is therefore ambiguous and could well be negative over time. Sectoral impacts: winners and losers. Winners might include a handful of domestic manufacturers who regain price competitiveness and import competing farmers or producers in niche goods. Losers would be broad: consumers, retailers, high-tech firms relying on software or hardware components, healthcare providers if drug costs rise, and logistics companies facing trade disruptions. Small businesses and low-income households would be hit harder proportionally because they spend more of their budget on essentials. Retaliation risk and trade war tariffs on this scale invite retaliation. India could impose its own tariffs on American goods, target agricultural exports, or restrict U.S. firms' access to Indian markets. A tit-for-tat escalation could reduce bilateral trade, harm exporters on both sides, and increase global economic uncertainty. Trade wars also discourage investment. Firms delay expansion if they fear volatile trade policies. Geopolitical consequences. The U.S.-India relationship is strategic, covering defense, technology, and regional security. A heavy-handed tariff could strain that partnership, pushing India to deepen ties with other powers or accelerate its own industrial strategies. In a world of competition with China, alienating India could be costly in geopolitical terms. Conversely, some domestic political constituencies might view tariffs as standing up for local workers, but international partners and markets would notice long-term structural shifts. Over the longer term, firms will adapt. Some supply chains might reshore to the U.S., which could boost domestic manufacturing capacity but at higher cost. Others will diversify sourcing to other countries, Vietnam, Mexico, Southeast Asia, raising fragmentation and complexity. Consumers may permanently shift buying habits or accept higher prices. Innovation and investment could suffer as resources are diverted to manage trade friction rather than productive activities. Policy trade-offs and alternatives. If the goal is to protect U.S. workers and reduce strategic dependence, there are more targeted, often less costly tools than blanket tariffs. Direct subsidies for domestic R&D and manufacturing, targeted trade remedies addressing unfair practices, investment in workforce retraining, and multilateral agreements that set fair rules. Smart industrial policy focuses on boosting competitiveness rather than blunt tax-like tariffs that penalize consumers. Conclusion. Call to action. In short, a 50% tariff on India would be a blunt instrument with real costs for American households, many businesses, and the broader economy. While it might shield a few industries in the short run, it risks inflation, job losses in input-dependent sectors, supply chain disruption, retaliation, and geopolitical strain. If policymakers are serious about protecting American interests, they should weigh targeted strategic measures over sweeping tariffs and include a careful cost-benefit analysis before acting. Thank you for watching. Please share, like, and subscribe.